So the Fallout show just recently came out, and I ended up binging the whole thing in a handful of days. And honestly, if you told me when it was first announced that I was going to enjoy a Fallout TV show, I probably would have just called you crazy. But I guess we are finally in the era of video game adaptations that actually turn out to be mildly good. Well, at least sometimes. But the show did get me thinking about the games again, but specifically how there's always something that has always bugged me, especially about the nature of Fallout 4's story in particular. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of things to criticize about the writing in this game. I know I have ranted at length about how badly written the Institute is on more than one occasion. However, I honestly think that regardless of the execution of the story, that the story that we got in Fallout 4 is the wrong kind of story for the kind of game that it is. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you see, my problems with Fallout 4's core storyline, the main quest, goes beyond the simple issue that I think the writing is bad, or that there are plot holes, or that certain characters or entire factions lack decent motivation. What I'm trying to say is that even if we imagine a scenario where the story of Fallout 4 was written to be the best possible version of itself, patching up all of its various plot holes and minor issues, improving the prose and the dialogue and all that stuff, that it would still not work as a story for the game that it is in because there is a fundamental misalignment with the kind of story being told and the kind of game that Fallout is. And before we start, I just want to give you a quick reminder that if you like what I have to say, that you should let me know by leaving me a like and a subscribe, because every little bit helps the channel out. Also, this video will contain spoilers for the story of Fallout 4. So let us start at the beginning. The pre-war opening of the game and how it is handled from a story perspective sort of acts as a microcosm for the kinds of issues that I'm talking about with this game's story. To give a quick recap of the general events at the start of the game, you actually start the game in 2077 on the day the bombs drop. You create your character, and then you and your spouse go to check on your baby. You get a knock on the door by a Vault Tech representative, which is used as an excuse to set your stats. Then the alarm starts sounding. You and your family rush out to your vault, and you sink inside just as the shockwave passes over you. From there, you're put into a quote-unquote decontamination pod, which in reality is a form of cryostasis, which freezes you for the next few hundred years. You wake up for a moment to see your spouse get murdered and your baby get kidnapped, before finally waking up for real to start the game properly. Now, there's a few problems I have with this opening, and like I said, most of them have to do with the nature of the game or issues that come from how the rest of the game functions more than the issues with the writing itself. For one, Fallout is primarily meant to be a role-playing game franchise, and Bethesda seems to really not want to give the player any kind of wiggle room in defining their own character's backstory. Based on the dialogue and stuff that you can find around your house, it's established that the male protagonist is always a war veteran that fought in the Sino-American War, and the female protagonist graduated from Suffolk County School of Law and is an acting attorney. Now, sure, having set protagonists with established backstories is fine when the game is set up for that. I don't need to be able to customize Kratos' backstory in God of War because I'm playing a game designed around specifically being Kratos. But Fallout is a game where you can play it however you want, so the dissonance really starts to pile up if you end up playing any other kind of character than what makes sense for your pre-written backstory. And so as a result, you can be a war veteran that has no points in strength or endurance and no skill with any kind of firearm. And you can be a lawyer that has no intelligence or charisma and all of their points in strength and luck. They simultaneously want to establish a very specific backstory for your character while also giving you the room to define that character's attributes and abilities, which can easily end up being completely incongruent with that backstory. And on a similar note, I think it's worth pointing out that in the main game itself, the relationship system with your companions is fairly progressive. You can be straight, gay, bi, whatever you want. You can even be polyamorous and get into a relationship with multiple companions at once without any conflict. And yet, the game locks in the player character into a heterosexual relationship right at the start. So, once again, the game actively goes against its own design during the intro. If you want to roleplay as a gay character for whatever reason, then I guess no matter what, you have to secretly be bisexual the whole time. And this is the kind of thing where, like, they could have easily fixed it by just not including your spouse in the story and leaving your backstory up to be a little bit more vague. I mean, your spouse only exists for a whopping 5 minutes of the game and only has a handful of lines of dialogue. They could have just as easily made the player a single parent, maybe allude to a spouse without being too specific during the Vault Tech interview. You could have carried baby Sean to the vault yourself and had him kidnapped from you directly without literally fridging your spouse instead. It really feels like one guy had the clever idea of making the player select their body type by having both spouses in the bathroom at the same time, and there was just zero consideration for what that meant for the rest of the game. By simply removing your spouse from the equation and being less specific about your player's backstory, the game's beginning dramatically improves and fits with the rest of the game way better, in my opinion. Sure, you're still locked into a backstory that ends up with you as a single parent living in suburbia, but at least that is much more open to personalization without creating any plot holes like the aforementioned idea of a soldier that doesn't know how to use a gun or a lawyer that doesn't know how to talk to people. However, I think that leads us naturally into talking about the main story for the game itself, and the problems only continue to pile up here. And right off the bat, I think that we have what I would argue is the game's biggest and most fundamental misalignment between the concept for the main story and the type of game that Fallout 4 is: rescuing baby Sean. After the intro, when you finally break free of the vault, your primary objective is to track down your missing child and their kidnapper. But if you think about it, you might see a problem with this premise for this story, given the kind of game that Fallout is. Fallout 4 is an open-world game based around exploring the wasteland and getting sidetracked by random quests and interesting landmarks.
Thou shalt get sidetracked by bullshit every goddamn time.
To me, that doesn't really fit very well in a story with a very dire premise revolving around recovering your kidnapped infant. Like, yeah, I know that at the end of the story, it's revealed that Sean isn't actually in any real danger because it's actually been over half a century since he was kidnapped. But the player, and especially the player character, isn't supposed to realize that yet. So, if you are actually role-playing as your character and reacting to the game's events accordingly, then logically, you should be devastated by the kidnapping of your child. Why would you even care about doing random stuff, like helping the Minutemen rebuild some towns, or all this nonsense with the Synths? You have a literal baby that you need to be saving. Do you see what the problem is now? This is why I don't think the issue is with the quality of the writing itself, because the story is kind of in a lose-lose situation. As it is now, I think that most people don't really get particularly invested in the story, or at least in the idea of trying to rescue baby Sean. So they end up neglecting their infant child for the sake of, you know, actually having fun trying to explore the game's world and building settlements and whatnot. But if we hypothetically rewrote the story into a much better version of itself, while keeping the main key events the same, so that the player was a lot more engaged and heavily invested in trying to rescue their baby, well, then we have the opposite problem of the story being constructed in such a way that it would encourage the player to neglect the entire rest of the game for the sake of saving their child. This is why I think that in general, if you're making an open world game where the player's allowed to go off and explore for hours before progressing any of your quests, then you need to be very careful about the kind of story that you're telling. If you have a plot beat be that a character is actively dying from a lethal disease, but then the player can just wander off to collect 100 pine cones or whatever before actually finding the cure, and then when you come back, the character is still alive, then that plot beat isn't going to hit very hard. And this is also why I think that Starfield of all games at least has a much better premise for its main story than games like Fallout 4. I know, I'm about to say something nice about Starfield, but hear me out for a second. In Starfield, the main story is about trying to track down these artifacts that have been scattered throughout the galaxy and discover their purpose and who made them. There's no galaxy-destroying threat like the Reapers that's coming to kill everyone. There's no kidnapped family members or stolen items that you're trying to get back or anything like that, at least not at the start. And nobody is stated to be in danger if you don't solve the mystery in time. And while ultimately I think that Starfield's story still fails to deliver a compelling narrative for a host of other reasons, at the very least I can say that the premise for the story makes sense for the kind of game that Starfield is. The player is free to chase down those artifacts as quickly as possible if that's what they want to do. But if they want to just explore the galaxy and do random side quests and whatnot, then they're also free to do that without it feeling like they're actively breaking the narrative by doing so. See? Even I can find at least one positive thing to say about Starfield. Let me just mark that one up on the board real quick and, there we go. So yeah, in my opinion, creating a story for an open world game can be a delicate balance. In many stories, you want to provide real stakes and consequences to make the story feel like it has weight to it, and to encourage the player to actually, engage with the narrative. But in an open world game, you also want to encourage the player to be able to effectively ignore the story and wander off to do whatever they want in whatever order they want. That's why I think that the best open world narratives, in my opinion, feature a much more general premise, like how in Breath of the Wild, the goal of the story is merely to kill Ganon, but the way that you accomplish that goal in an open world game should be completely up to the player. You can go straight and do all of the main story quests right away, but a good open world story should at least be able to accommodate a halfway decent reason to want to also explore the world and do various side activities as well. Ganon is right there just waiting for you to go kill him, and you can go attack him at any time, but you also start out the game as a weakling with no gear that needs to train and gather equipment so that you can be ready for that final confrontation. And then along the way, you can tell shorter, more self-contained stories throughout the world as the player explores. Getting back to Fallout 4 itself, I haven't even really gotten into the details of the rest of the story, but to be honest, I think that most of my problems are the same kind of issues that I've talked about already. The story just clearly isn't designed to accommodate an open world game, and very few of the story's key themes and plot elements actually reflect themselves in the gameplay. A huge part of the narrative is supposed to be about these humanoid robots called Synths, and how people are constantly paranoid and afraid for their lives because for all they know, anyone anywhere could turn out to be a synth at any time, and synths are known for suddenly activating and killing everyone in sight out of nowhere. But again, this is barely reflected in the gameplay at all outside of a few pre-baked story sequences. When you build settlements, you can have synth settlers show up and infiltrate your base, and allegedly over time they can sometimes go crazy and start randomly killing people. But in all the hours I spent playing this game, most of which was spent building and managing towns because I'm just that kind of guy, I never really had an issue with this. The idea of being paranoid or scared that any one of my settlers could secretly be a synth is frankly kinda laughable. I mean, how much damage is a couple of random synths supposed to be able to cause when I have a base full to the brim with armed settlers, custom-made combat robots, and turrets? Say what you will about the Dragonblight and Dragon's Dogma 2, but at least that game knew to give the disease a dire enough consequence so that the player would be legitimately terrified and paranoid about setting it off. But again, I think that the issue comes down to this being the wrong kind of story for this game. If you did change the undercover synth mechanics and made them a lot scarier and able to kill off entire settlements like we hear about them doing in the lore, then that would mean that at any time you could come home to a settlement that you built and spent hours working on to not only find every single random NPC killed, but also have to now deal with an army of angry angry robots that you now have to fight on your own. Like the Dragon Blight, this kind of mechanic would make me legitimately terrified of the threat of synths, like the game's story clearly wants me to be. But in doing so, it would also heavily discourage any and all players from wanting to even touch the settlement building system with a 10-foot pole. So once again, we're kind of stuck in this lose-lose situation. Either the synth threat is made significant enough in the gameplay to be an actual threat, but in turn players would be discouraged from partaking in a huge part of the game's mechanics, or the synths are made toothless so that the player isn't scared off from building settlements, but now the story's themes of paranoia are completely rendered null and void. No matter which way you go, it just doesn't work as a premise for the kind of game that Fallout 4 ended up being. I could likely go on for hours about other random issues I have with the writing in Fallout 4, but I think you get the idea by now. The issue isn't even with the fact that Fallout 4's writing is bad or that there are plot holes or whatever. Obviously those are problems, but even if you improved the writing in a later draft and made the story that much more engaging, even if you improve certain elements of the gameplay to better reinforce the story's main themes and goals, all you would accomplish is discouraging the player from actually exploring the open world and doing anything but address those big important main story plot elements. A better written version of this story with the same story beats would still be a bad story for this kind of open world game. The only way to actually salvage it, in my opinion, is frankly to just start over from scratch and try something completely different. Now, I'm not about to sit here and try to rewrite an entire AAA video game from scratch, but if I had to come up with a better premise for the story, I think that it should have been about rebuilding the wasteland and properly restarting your own society from scratch. That way, the game's settlement mechanics would inherently tie into the main themes of the story, instead of being this kind of weird tumor that is at best only tangentially related to what's going on. Even if the player doesn't want to spend time rebuilding settlements, then they could focus on building up and improving existing settlements, like Diamond City, with different towns starting off in different states for the player to build off of. And by making the story primarily about helping out these towns, a key part of that would be to gather supplies and materials for them to use, not to mention having to go out and find other settlements to make connections with and form partnerships. So a core part of the main story would be explicitly about going out and exploring the Commonwealth and doing whatever side activities you want to do along the way, because as long as you're finding resources and meeting people, you're also working towards the main quest line. Then you could do things like have each faction play into the different methods and philosophies behind how you could restart society. A huge choice the player would have to make would be what kinds of factions they want to make allies or enemies of, with each faction potentially representing opposing ideologies or directions that you could go. The mere presence of the military might of the Brotherhood of Steel would suddenly be a much bigger deal, and interacting with them would always have a lot of tension behind it, since they could just wipe off and take over your fledgling settlement just completely overnight. You could even still include the Institute and the Synths if you really wanted to, but in the context of trying to convince them that you could be using their technologies to directly rebuild the wasteland. Hell, if you really are that attached to the railroad and the whole slavery and civil rights metaphor that the synths are tied to, then you could maybe turn that into a much more interesting moral quandary that the player themselves has to deal with. You could be offered synths from the Institute to use as extra labor to help make rebuilding the wasteland a lot faster and easier than it was before, even using them as foot soldiers to help defend your settlements, maybe from the Brotherhood of Steel. But with the obvious moral trade-off being that you are effectively enslaving these sentient beings to your will. And I think that that makes for an interesting story and a way more interesting moral dilemma than the half-hearted Underground Railroad metaphor that they went for in the real game. But yeah, the big takeaway from this is that not every kind of story will necessarily work for every kind of game. It may sound obvious, but I feel like so many developers seemingly create their story and gameplay in completely separate vacuums from one another, and then act all surprised when it results in a confusing mess. To me, it feels like the story of Fallout 4 was designed for a much more curated linear experience, and maybe in that context it could have worked a lot better, especially if the writers had more time to focus on refining that narrative and patching up various holes and other minor issues. But at the end of the day, it's not just about the quality of the writing, it's about how it's delivered and what the rest of the game is like around it. You could be the best writer in the world and write a long, compelling narrative for your game with interesting themes sprinkled in throughout. But if the game surrounding that narrative doesn't reinforce those themes, or at worst, actively goes against them, then you're going to create a dissonance that makes your story fall flat. Games are an interactive medium, so if the story that you make doesn't meaningfully interact with the player, then the player isn't going to interact with your story in return. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. I know that it's not exactly controversial to call the story of Fallout 4 bad, but I'm curious if you guys think I'm onto something about some of the real underlying reasons as to why the story doesn't work beyond just the quality of the writing itself. So feel free to let me know your thoughts down below. And if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like. If you want to see me make more videos like this, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make more videos like this in the future. And if you really want to help the channel out, then you can become a member on YouTube or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.